Good morning and welcome to the third and final day of the CNAS Annual National Security Conference. I'm Richard Fontaine, the CEO of the Center for New American Security. And I'm really pleased to kick off this last day with a conversation with Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to President Biden. Jake has been National Security Advisor since the inception of this administration and served in the same role for Vice President Biden, also served as Director of Policy Planning in the Obama administration, as Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and a lot more besides. So there's nobody better placed to share thoughts about how the administration's conceptualizing its approach to the world when there's a lot going on. So Jake, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Pleased to have you here. For those watching the conversation, if you want to join in, you can submit questions using the chat on our official conference website. That's conference.cnas.org, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So Jake, let me start with the war in Ukraine, which obviously is on everyone's minds. The administration's been making major efforts to help the Ukrainians resist the Russian onslaught. When asked the big question, how does this end? The administration will often say, well, it's up to the Ukrainians. We're not going to tell the Ukrainians what the terms should be and all this stuff. But surely the administration has to have a view on what constitutes a better or worse or a more realistic or less realistic sort of end, whether that's a difference between fighting to February 24th lines or liberating all of Crimea or something like that. So how are you thinking about where this is headed and what the sort of realistic outcome might be of the war there?
Well, especially given how dynamic things are on the battlefield, and also the fact that we are in support of a sovereign country that is ultimately going to chart its own destiny, we have in fact refrained from laying out what we see as an end game, what we see as objectives. So we've been focused on what we can do today, tomorrow, next week to strengthen the Ukrainians' hand to the maximum extent possible, first on the battlefield and then ultimately at the negotiating table. We think this will have to end through diplomacy, and we want the Ukrainians to be in the strongest position possible when that diplomacy gets engaged in a fuller way. And from our perspective, that has to be the thrust and purpose of our policy. So diplomacy to what end is a perfectly reasonable question, but right now, sitting here today in June, our view is that that's something the Ukrainians will have to shape through an internal democratic discourse in their country. And our job is not to define those terms or define those objectives at the end. Our job is to give them the tools they need to put themselves in the strongest position possible. So we'll continue to do that with our partners. As the president said in the op-ed that he wrote in the New York Times, we're not going to be pressing them to make territorial concessions. We think that's inconsistent with international law and is just frankly wrong. But we are going to support and consult with them as they think about how they want to approach a negotiated outcome with the Russians. And for the time being, supporting them in that means supporting them through the steady provision of weapons and intelligence, which yesterday we just announced another $1 billion of.
Yes, I have a question on that. The amount of weapons that the United States and other countries have provided is huge, quick. It's probably unprecedented in scope to have the transfer of that level of weapons over such a short time to another country, particularly when that country is in the middle of a war. There's talk now, everyone has learned the term HIMARS, which they probably didn't know even a few days ago, other than people in the sort of wonky military realm. But there's a lot of talk about the Ukrainian request for 60 or for 100 HIMARS. These are these truck-borne rocket launchers, and the administration providing 4 or so, and the UK providing some, and things like that. Is there a gap between what the Ukrainians are asking for in terms of weapons that would be able to hit beyond the Russian lines and what the administration is prepared to provide?
Well, first, it's the Ukrainians' job to ask for as many as they can possibly get their hands on, and it's our job to deliver to them to the extent that we feel there are trained personnel and the capacity to actually put those to use in an effective way. And so we have given an initial 4. And actually, we have moved the training at a really rapid and efficient pace so that those can be deployed onto the battlefield in short order. As you said, the UK are providing systems. The Germans have said they will provide systems. And in the next drawdown package from the United States, we anticipate that there will be further delivery of systems as well. So we have to take this step by step. And one of the key considerations in how we deliver these systems is how many can be absorbed effectively onto the battlefield. These are highly sophisticated systems that require real training. We've trained an initial cadre of Ukrainians to be able to use them, but as you increase the number of systems, you obviously have to increase the number of personnel being prepared to use them. So that will be a process that unfolds over the course of the coming weeks and months. And we think that over time, through close consultations with the Ukrainians at both the professional and the political level, we'll come to a good understanding about how many of these HIMARS we end up giving. President Biden spoke with President Zelensky yesterday at some length. They actually went through in detail the Ukrainian requests and the Western fulfillment of those requests on a number of systems: artillery, MLRS, armored personnel carriers, ammunition, et cetera. And we feel good about where we are.
Okay, great. Let me step back and ask you about kind of the nature of the global competition that we're in. The president and other folks in the administration have often framed a contest of democracies versus autocracies, where there's really a fight for the preservation of our democratic systems and our way of life and so forth. To what degree is that kind of the animating way of understanding what we're in the world, and how does that square with, the fact that on Russia, for example, there are lots of democracies that don't have the view on sanctions, for example, that we have India, most of the Western Hemisphere, and then on China, there are autocracies that have the view that we do have, Vietnam or something, or the need to, deal with a country like Saudi Arabia, where the president's going next month, which would seem to complicate this sort of framing. But how do you and the president see that?
I think, first of all, to answer your direct question, how much is this an animating principle? It is deeply animating for the president and for the administration's foreign policy. It's instinctive for him. It's rooted in a long history of engagement on foreign policy, going back decades as a senator, as vice president, and now as president. And it meets the moment we're in today, where both the acute geopolitical challenge we face, Russia, and the long-term pacing challenge we face in China are autocratic systems that are looking to remake the international order in their image. And so at two levels, the president approaches the question of democracies versus autocracies. One is about the system itself and proving the viability, durability, and success of the system. And he often talks about how democracies have to show that they can deliver for their citizens and that it is a superior form of governance to autocracies at this critical moment. That's a little less about foreign policy, although there are obviously foreign policy implications to it. The second is that we have built an international rules-based order that fundamentally reflects a set of values and principles that create a healthy environment for democracies to flourish. And we want to protect and update that order in ways consistent with our values. Does that mean we only work with democracies to do it? Of course not. And that's never been a part of our proposition. If you go back to the Reagan era or the Kennedy era or the Eisenhower era, and you look at a time when the forces of freedom were seeking to define a better future for the world against a major autocratic competitor, we didn't write off all countries that weren't democratic, nor will we do that today. Whether we're talking about Southeast Asia or the Middle East or other parts of the world, we're prepared to work with many different kinds of countries, provided they are prepared to step up and support an overall effort to defend the rules-based order from the kinds of assaults that are being launched against it by some of the major geopolitical competitors of the United States. And so I think there is nothing inconsistent with saying we want a balance of power that favors freedom in the world and saying we're prepared to work with a range of partners to be able to achieve that strategic outcome. And we've invested in relationships with the core democracies of the world through the G7 and other formats. And we've also invested in relationships with Vietnam, with Gulf countries and others. And we think that there is a long bipartisan tradition of that that has borne results for American foreign policy.
And presumably, if non-democracies wish to oppose the cardinal transgression against the rules-based international order, which is territorial conquest by force, then we would welcome that.
Of course.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by, in a way, that's a more concrete way of saying my more abstract statement about countries that line up to defend the rules-based international order.
Right. Countries
that say, no, we're not going to allow this kind of rampant revisionism or this transgression of fundamental principles. Do we want to see them engaged in political reform and moving down the track towards more open and democratic societies? Of course, but are we prepared to work with them in service of defending these core principles? We are. And on the flip side, while it's true there are democratic countries in the world that haven't signed up to sanctions, I would point out that at the UN General Assembly, you mentioned Latin America, we had 141 countries condemning the action, the brutal invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and most of the Western Hemisphere lined up to support that. And when the president was just at the Summit of the Americas, the leaders had an extended discussion about Ukraine, and there was actually general contempt for what Putin has done there, even if we have a different view on some of the tools like sanctions.
How much, if at all, is this issue divisive in our close relationships? So take India as an example, which has not adopted the sanctions, buying oil from Russia, abstained at the UN and so forth, and yet it's been a bipartisan project dating back to the Clinton administration to forge closer ties with India across the full range of activities. Does that harm or hinder those ambitions to forge close relations with India, or is it just a difference of opinion that we can manage easily?
It's certainly a difference in perspective that we have to be direct with our Indian counterparts about how we view the situation, how we would encourage them to, over time, take a different perspective themselves. But they're a sovereign, democratic nation. They will make their own decisions, and we're not here to lecture them or to insist on a certain outcome or else. We're having, I would say, a deep, respectful, and strategic dialogue with India, starting with the president and the prime minister, who have spoken frequently by phone and just met a couple of weeks ago in Tokyo. And we're playing the long game here. We are investing in a relationship that we are not going to judge by one issue, even if that issue is quite consequential, but rather that we are going to judge over the fullness of time as we try to work to convergence on the major strategic questions facing our two countries. On one of those questions, how to deal with the challenge posed by China, there's much more convergence today, and that is important to U.S. foreign policy. On the question of Russia, obviously we have different historical perspectives, different muscle memories, but we feel confident that the dialogue we have going with India right now will bear fruit over time in a way that is not about forcing them to change or demanding things of them, but rather is the kind of iterative approach in a strategic relationship that, tended well, will lead to better outcomes.
So if we were having this conversation last fall, we would have started with China and probably struggled to talk about other issues. Having it today, it's hard to talk about issues not related to Russia and the Russian war, and the reasons for this are entirely obvious. But the world goes on, and the priority that the administration has set on the Indo-Pacific as a region and China as the long-term challenge endures while you have to deal with Russia. And this involves prioritization and trade-offs and things like this, right? So, the U.S.-ASEAN summit, you have the leaders come, and there's for the first time, we should add, because it was a great diplomatic initiative, and $150 million of U.S. investment in Southeast Asia pledge. The very same week, the Congress is getting ready to do $40 billion for Ukraine. Very good reasons for both of those things, but it does seem to put some tension in how do we balance our interests and our activities and our resources across these regions. So what's the answer? How do you do that?
Yeah, it's, it kind of comes down to what is the purpose of the resources or assistance. At the end of the day, if you're going to supply large amounts of high quality weaponry, it's going to cost a lot of money, direct budget support. So that's why you get the kinds of numbers in the Ukraine supplemental. In the case of Southeast Asia, what we're really trying to stimulate is a long-term economic relationship rooted in private sector investment, not in massive cash transfers from the American Treasury to these countries. And that means taking relatively smaller amounts of money and leveraging significant private sector investment to add up to billions and ultimately tens of billions of dollars that will do everything from strengthen our supply chains to helping these countries with clean energy transition, to helping them move into an even more high technology phase. And actually, when the president goes to the G7 next weekend, he will be launching a partnership for global infrastructure, physical, health, and digital infrastructure that we think can provide an alternative to what the Chinese are offering, to the tune of tens and ultimately hundreds of billions of dollars when you add in what our G7 partners are going to do as well. And that's at relatively modest direct budget allocations from the United States. So fundamentally, it's about different tools in different places. And we think that this model of US government dollars leveraging huge private sector dollars can pay massive dividends across the Indo-Pacific. And we intend for this to be one of the hallmarks of the Biden administration foreign policy over the remainder of his tenure.
Great. Couple of specific questions. So Taiwan, the president now 3 times has said that he would defend Taiwan, and then the administration, including him, have then said, well, the policy hasn't changed, but I will defend seems different than we may defend. So what is the policy of, is it strategic ambiguity that we may or may not defend Taiwan if attacked?
Our policy is the same with respect to Taiwan as it has been through a bipartisan consensus over the course of multiple presidencies. It's the One China policy, the 3 joint communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances, and fundamentally, the entire thrust and purpose of our approach, our diplomatic, defense, security, intelligence approach to Taiwan is about ensuring that the day never comes where the question is called as to whether or not we have to defend Taiwan, because we will have effectively deterred it. That is what our policy is all about. And that policy is the same today as it was in the last administration and the administration before that. Now, you've just highlighted a kind of tension within the policy. I would just offer to you that going back to the early 1970s, when the first joint communique was negotiated between the Nixon administration and Mao, there has been a tension inherent in Taiwan policy. The very notion of the One China policy, the 3 joint communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances, contains multitudes. And so I don't regard that as a bug in our Taiwan policy, but rather as a feature. And it is a feature that has actually served us relatively well in terms of managing a difficult relationship and maintaining peace and stability across the strait. The challenge I think we face today is that Beijing is increasingly engaged in activities that are threatening peace and stability across the strait. And we believe that it is very important to stand firmly on principle and against those kinds of destabilizing activities, and that's what we're trying to do.
There's a question from the audience. Ryan basically asks what you and Young Jushi talked about, but it's more articulate than that. Can you tell us whether there's any consensus between the U.S. and China on the Ukraine war or on North Korea's possible nuclear test?
So on the Ukraine war, what I would say is that we have not seen China move forward with any form of direct military assistance to Ukraine, and we've not seen them undertake systematic efforts to help the Russians evade the sanctions and export controls. Yesterday, I saw a very interesting juxtaposition of 2 articles that came out at the same time reporting on the call between President Xi and President Putin, when President Putin called Xi to wish him a happy birthday. One was from the AP, the other was from the Wall Street Journal. The headline of one was, China offers support to Russia for Ukraine war. The other headline was, China withholds support to Ukraine for to Russia for the Ukraine war. Right. And you could read the readout kind of both ways, going back to the conversation we were just having about Taiwan. It's, has China come out and voted against Russia in either the Security Council or the General Assembly? No.
Right.
Has China gone out and said, look, we're behind Russia on this thing, they're doing the right thing? No. They're taking a very careful approach to this. And on the issues that we have pressed them particularly hard on, the provision of assistance, the evasion of sanctions, we believe that China has not taken steps that cross those lines. On North Korea, we have expressed our concern that North Korea is preparing to conduct another nuclear test. We have said that publicly. We have communicated that to China, and the proof will be in the pudding. Let's see how things play out. But both of these subjects featured prominently in our discussions on Monday in Europe, the discussion I had with my counterpart Yang, as well as an extended discussion on Taiwan too, where we communicated our view that we need to see the maintenance of peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, and I raised my concerns about what China's up to.
So moving to Iran, many observers, myself included, thought we would probably be back in the JCPOA by now. Obviously, there's a dilemma over the Quds Force designation, and this is after the Russians tried to, sort of leverage their own sanctions and claim that they should get an exemption there and things like that. So, as we sit here today, do you have a sense of where the Iran nuclear deal is heading, particularly against the backdrop of dismantling IAEA cameras and increasing the uranium enrichment levels?
Yeah. So, the steps that Iran is taking with respect to enrichment and respect to these verification mechanisms, the removal of the cameras, for example, these are fundamentally unhelpful steps, and we are responding by ourselves, increasing the economic pressure on Iran. We have done additional designations. There will be more to come on that score. But all of that from our side, and the Iranians have said the same thing about what they've done on the cameras, could be dealt with in the context of a compliance for compliance return to the JCPOA. That remains a live possibility. There is a deal on the table that the Iranians could take that would serve our interests, our allies' interests, and that would, from our perspective, provide Iran with what they had been offered under the Iran nuclear deal. Now, the Iranians may not be able to get there, in which case we will work with our allies and partners in the region, in Europe and elsewhere, to continue to sharpen the choice for them, to continue to impose costs and consequences for that. But our view is that we should leave aside the extraneous issues, focus on the core of the JCPOA, and go back to it. And really the ball is in Iran's court on this, and we'll see what they do over the coming days.
And then sort of moving around the globe a little more, so Turkey. Turkey is had some odd alignments, been constructive at some times and frustrating at other times, democratic rollback at home, and an ally. And so complicated situation. Heading into the Madrid summit, the very welcome news, I think, to many people that Sweden and Finland wish to apply for and become the newest members of NATO. Turkey, President Erdogan sort of suggesting that at a minimum there'll be some price that he might be able to extract from the allies or from Sweden and Finland. Do you expect Sweden and Finland to become members of NATO? And how do you see Turkey's role in that and more broadly?
I do expect Finland and Sweden to become members of NATO. Turkey has raised concerns. Those concerns largely relate to the issue of terrorism and the PKK. The Swedes and the Finns have both indicated they are prepared to address Turkey's concerns. There have been high-level engagements between the Swedes and Finns and the Turkish president and his team. A couple of days ago in Europe, I actually sat down with my Turkish counterpart, the National Security Advisor, to talk through the way ahead on this. And yesterday, there were high-level engagements between NATO and the Turkish government. I can't give you an exact timeline on the resolution of these issues, but what I can tell you is there is a commitment on all sides to figure out a way forward to ultimately produce this historic outcome where these two countries with a long history of neutrality join the NATO alliance, and in doing so, massively enhance the overall capacity of the alliance, because these are two strong security partners with critical geographical realities that will help us be able to deal with a Russian threat that is going to remain acute for the foreseeable future.
One of the things that the administration, that the president have emphasized is the connection between everyday Americans and foreign policy for the middle class, but I think more broadly, the idea that what happens in our foreign policy and outside our shores actually matters to the everyday lives of Americans. Some of this gets lost when you're sitting around talking with think tankers about, a rules-based international order and great power competition in our world and things like that. But how do you think about, so take maybe two of the big questions here that are kind of out there. One is China's ascendance and its illiberalism. And then the other is Russia's violent transgression of international rules. For someone who doesn't do this stuff for a living, what does that actually mean in their future if the United States were to take a different position on these things, to not care about these things, to not push back against Russian aggression, to not try to shape the world in which China's technology or its economics or its political choices become more dominant? So can you give a sense of just how you think about that connection to the lives of everyday Americans?
Well, just starting with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, if the United States let that stand without challenge or check, it would send a message to other would-be aggressors, including China, that they could do the same thing. And then all of a sudden you're looking at major countries with significant militaries taking territory, and in doing so, destabilizing not just the quote-unquote rules-based international order, but the global economy in really profound and fundamental ways that end up hurting everyday people here in the United States. If war and conflict starts, and wars of conquest in particular, start becoming the norm rather than the flagrant exception, the impacts on everything from food to energy to semiconductors and high technology to basic supply chains would be profound, and the hit on the lives and livelihoods of average people in the United States would be amplified, magnified exponentially over time. So drawing a line now to try to ensure stability will end up sustaining or helping sustain a longer period of peace and prosperity in the future. On the question of what happens if China comes to dominate the world or become the most powerful, influential actor economically, technologically, politically, three things. First, the space for free expression, free association, free engagement across democracies starts to get squeezed as the world gets more and more safe for the kind of surveillance-based repressive authoritarianism that is practiced by the Chinese government. Second, the economic rules of the road, we're dealing with an uneven playing field right now that we're trying to remedy, would become even more out of whack in favor of China and at the expense of American workers and businesses. And that would have profound consequences for us. And then third and finally, our ability to solve big problems that matter to Americans, COVID, climate, nuclear nonproliferation. If the United States is not playing a central role in rallying the world to solve those problems that end up coming back home to roost for people in the United States, counterterrorism being another one, and that's left to China or is left to no one, we're all worse off. So I think across all of these elements, people in my hometown, in yours, have to think about not so much what is the immediate consequence of Putin taking a town in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, but rather what are the long-term ripple and radiating effects of these kinds of aggressive moves by authoritarian superpowers. And when you play out that world, it is a world that is darker and harsher for American families, and it's one we need to stand against and in favor of a vision for the world that actually delivers a better life for people. And that's the core of what we're trying to do every day through a turbulent and crisis-laden international landscape.
Jake, thank you for joining us. Thanks so much. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. We're going to let the National Security Advisor get back to the people's work, but we're really grateful for you sharing your thoughts and insights with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
and for those who are tuning in, we'll be back at 10 a.m., so just in a few minutes, with a Safe at Home session featuring Assistant Attorney General Matt Olson and CNAS Gates Senior Fellow Carrie Cardero. So stick around for that. Thanks again, Jake.
Thanks.